Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's present at this call. Thank you for joining us for a recap. This is something that we invited Sean Lloyd, our presenter, today to first engage with us in ICANN 83. Because we're going to have another session in Mumbai at ICANN 85, we thought it was worthwhile for Sean to come and recap what he explained to us before, which is the purpose of today's webinar. Sean is a member of the Security, Stability and Resiliency team, which is a department under the ICANN Office of the Chief Technology Officer, hence the acronym OCTO-SSR. And he's been there for quite some time, I remember, at least for a few years now. And he's very kindly accepted our invitation to come and talk to you about the things that OCTO-SSR does, especially in relation to DNS abuse mitigation. So I'm happy to hand the floor over to you, Sean.
Thank you very much. I will just put my slides up. Yes, my name's Sean Lloyd, and as you've already heard, this is essentially a recap, a repeat of a session that we gave at ICANN 83 in Prague. It covers a bit of background about who we are, how we think as a group, what sort of work we do. And then we look at a few of our research projects, not all of them. We will actually address a couple of different research projects when we give the session in ICANN 85 in Mumbai. So it forms like a background, if you like, an introduction to us as a team. So this is what I will talk about in this session, a little bit of background. Like I say, I'm going to talk about a particular project called Domain Metrica, which is a DNS abuse measurement project. And then we will look at a couple of other research projects, not in very much detail. More detail was available in the session from Prague, and that is recorded if you're interested, or there's other resources on our SSR webpage that will give you more detail on any of these pieces of work. The final topic that I will cover is a project called Informal, which is work that wasn't actually carried out within ICANN. It was an ICANN-funded project, but it's work that was done under our guidance and at the request of the ICANN community. Okay. So this is the makeup of the Office of the Chief Technology Officer. And you can see a number of groups here. We have the research team. They look at things like DNS protocol, DNSSEC, new technologies that may have an impact on the DNS space. We have technical engagement. Those are the people who do a lot of good work around capacity building. They give, if you've seen any of the How It Works lectures or presentations at an ICANN meeting, that's the technical engagement team that give those. So you've probably interacted with them or met them. We have the operations team. They give us all the support that we need. So project management, procurement, all the sort of stuff that you need to happen in the background to allow us to do our jobs smoothly. And then we have the team that I work in, which is SSR Research, or Stability, Security, Resiliency Research Team. And we're a relatively small team. There's 4 of us who work there, including who manages the rest of the team. And as you can see, we all have academic backgrounds, and that's the philosophy that we bring with us to our work. We look at data from an academic, from a scientific point of view. So when we think about DNS insecurity, DNS abuse, there's a few statements that we keep in mind when we think about what this problem is and what does it mean and how does it impact people. So we know that there's an ecosystem around domain names, DNS, its infrastructure, all those processes and different parties involved. And at every step, there's potential for insecurity, for things to go wrong, for things to be abused or misused in ways that weren't intended and can be harmful. So when we talk about DNS abuse, we have fairly strict definitions of what we include. And so we think about phishing, impersonation in order to steal credentials or login accounts. We think about malware, which are software that will have some unintended and harmful consequence if run on a machine. We think about botnet command and control, which is a way that bad actors can control their environment, their little network of computers that are infected to make them do harmful things. There's a couple of other parts that we don't generally work on very closely. There's spam, but only when it's a delivery mechanism for one of those other harmful behaviors. So we tend to focus on those behaviors rather than spam because that's where the actual harm is occurring. And the other one is farming. And farming is abusing DNS to direct people to the wrong place. But because of the way that's done, it's quite often delivered via malware. If it's something that will change the DNS settings on your computer, or it's something where a DNS server is acting maliciously. And those are quite hard to track down. And then we tend not to get reports of them. So when we think about DNS abuse, we really think about those three: phishing, malware, botnet command and control. And the others we're aware of, but they're harder to quantify. So why does DNS abuse exist? Why can these bad things happen? And these arguments that we have up, they're not specific to DNS. These are from an economic paper. It's an argument from an economic point of view. And the statements are that security failure is caused at least as often by bad or misaligned incentives as by bad design. So what that means is that where it doesn't have to be a particular flaw that's built in to a system, it doesn't have to be something that's poorly designed or poorly written. It's quite often just the incentives are wrong. So the defensive cost perhaps is so great that maybe it doesn't make sense for people to put their money into that side of it when actually they can get more return on their investment by doing other things. So that's what we think about as the misaligned incentive. And then the other statement that systems are particularly prone to failure when the person guarding them is not the person who suffers when they fail. So that's another misaligned incentive, particularly that trade-off between attack and defense. Can I attack a system? But how much does it cost me to defend it? So we think a lot in our team about how to improve the incentives so how do we make it more attractive to put money and effort and resource into that defensive side? And one way that we can look at that, and one way where we believe we can have an influence, is by providing good metrics. And metrics are important because metrics can show you how well or how badly you're doing at a particular task. They can show you areas where performance needs to be improved or where quick wins can be made potentially. The flip side of metrics is if you get them wrong, you can incentivize the wrong behaviors. So you could be misleading, excuse me, or you could actually make something look like an attractive way of dealing with a problem, but actually it's not tackling the root cause, or it's not tackling the main issues that are prevalent in that system. So one of the things that we do is we ingest a lot of raw data, and raw data can come in many different forms. We have email data, so just what the email body that's been reported for phishing, for example. We have reputation block lists. Those are lists of domains or URLs that have been observed to be behaving maliciously in one form or another. We have access to zone files, so which domains are actually delegated, which name servers are responsible for those domains. We have DNS records, so things like passive DNS, what was returned to this particular query when it was made on this particular day. And there are lots of other data sets, certificate transparency. So, what SSL certificates have been issued for what particular domain names. Lots of different bits of data, which can be very useful on their own. But actually, it's by combining those data sets, by filtering those data sets to remove entries that perhaps you're not interested in, by looking at what happens if we only consider domains that exist. For example, does that filter out a lot of entries that maybe aren't interesting because they've already been mitigated? The domain is suspended already, so it's not actually doing any harm. Combining data and doing work on that data to make it more meaningful, to put context around it, that's when we get what we believe are better metrics at the end of the day. So that's one of the ways we work. There's a number of different ways we can do that. There's a few listed here. Just taking that raw data and making it more useful to the end user. So I'm going to stop there. That's the introduction to the team. I don't know if there's any questions now. I can take them quickly, or I can move on to talk about domain metrica.
Thanks, Sean. There is a question from Maciek in chat, which he says, you mentioned you don't get many reports on farming. Do you think security research companies like CrowdStrike, Splunk, etc. could do more for you, or certs maybe?
I think it's an interesting problem. There's been a few historic cases. There's something called DNS Changer. If you Google that, you'll find a lot of interesting reports about it. And that was a very large campaign. It was delivered via malware, and so it gained attention and people looked at it. The problem is there's probably, and I'm not sure there's any evidence actually gathered on this, but if you think about something like cache poisoning, that happens for a very short time at a local level. So it's actually quite hard to get statistics on the prevalence of it, on how serious the issues can be. And yes, I think there is a lot of work we could do on it, but there's a very open question on how that data can be gathered effectively and efficiently. I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it goes some way to answering.
Sorry, Ashish just came in with a question. Are there any false positives involved with RBL? If so, does it outweigh the advantage?
Yes, there are false positives for a number of reasons. And one of the pieces of work that I will be talking about at ICANN 85 is actually how we choose our RBLs and how we filter and try and get all the useful information whilst removing the false positives. So yes, there are. Yes, it's a big problem. We do understand it and we do take steps to remove those when we generate statistics. I see Jonathan has his hand up.
Yes, go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for your presentation. I guess I just have a question about the semantics of all this, because in my mind, when we talk about phishing, we're talking about the lure which is often an email, a SMS message, or something like that, to bring someone to a farming site. So they seem intertwined. So when you say people don't report farming, but they are reporting fishing, I don't know what you mean by when you're talking about farming. You're talking about the sites that are designed to look like. Are we talking about the same thing? The sites that are designed to look like some other site, basically?
So farming is defined as returning incorrect DNS responses somehow. So that could be cache poisoning, it could be on the fly, or causes you to use a different DNS resolver than the one you were expecting to use. So yes, it will be bundled up with malware and potentially with phishing as a delivery mechanism. And that's part of the problem, disentangling it from those that should actually correctly be classified as farming. And so, yes, there is a little bit of an issue there. And it's something that we do look at is the correct classification and categorization of all of these forms of DNS abuse.
Yeah, I guess because I don't think of farming as returning incorrect information, but simply being led to the wrong domain, basically. And then from there, you're operating correctly and from a technical standpoint, right? I mean, you're navigating that fake website, but it's operating as a normal website. It's not like a technical failure. It's more that they've designed it to look like Bank of America or something like that, and in order to capture a password or something of that sort. That's what I think of as a farming site, is a site that's designed to be a clone of a legitimate site.
Yes, in some cases, it could well be classified as phishing. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, no more questions?
Moving on, one of the projects that we've been working on, and probably one of the more visible bits of work we've done, is Domain Metrica. Domain Metrica is a measurement platform. We take in data on DNS abuse, and we provide those statistics in different ways. Statistics and raw data can be seen and downloaded and accessed via an API. The idea is that this is one way we can get that data to people who want to make use of it. So anyone who has an ICANN account can log into Domain Metrica. They can play with the system. I'll show you what it looks like. But this is open to everyone. That was really important to us when we were building it. So if you log in, you get a dashboard, and that contains a number of sort of high-level statistics. So how many domains have we seen? How many reports on those domains have we seen? So reports of abusive behaviors. How are they distributed amongst the different GTLDs, so on? And also, and what do those look like as a proportion of the total set of domains that we have in play? So the other thing that we can do, as well as present sort of headline broad statistics, is we can search for specific entities. So we can search for a specific TLD, a specific registrar, or a specific domain. And then we get more detailed information on that particular entity. So here we see a search on a particular TLD. We can see how large is the zone, when was it delegated, who's the registry behind this particular TLD. And then we can see some of the statistics on the reported abuse, but just within that specific domain, within that specific TLD. We also provide charts. So as well as seeing the statistics as they stand today, we can show trends. We can show trends going back up to a year. By default, we show 30 days. And we allow people to interact with these charts. So you can add other TLDs and compare 2, 3, up to 5 new TLDs together. We can filter by abuse type. So if we look at this particular example, phishing is almost always the dominant abuse type that we see reports on, to the point where if you're looking at the malware and botnet signals, they're really pushed down low in the graph, so you can't see what's happening. But maybe you're interested in them. So what we allow you to do is remove that phishing report line, and then the others can be seen in more clear detail. We also allow to compare against all other entities. So if you search for a TLD, you can compare against all the other TLDs that we have access to. If you search for a registrar, then you would see a comparison against all other registrars. So it lets you see where a particular entity sits in relation to their peers. And then the other step we allow is when you generate a graph that you're interested in or a data set that you're interested in, you can then download that underlying data as either CSV or JSON format, because maybe you have a data set of your own that you want to join with that data. So this allows you to do that. You can download it, you can put it in a spreadsheet, load it up in a scripting language, whatever you want to do with it, and generate your own graphs from that data. Everything that you can do in that web front end that we were looking at, we can also do via an API. So this is more useful if you perhaps want to have a regular cadence of retrieving data that you're going to do something else with. You don't have to go into the web UI and download the data via that mechanism. You can use the API and get the data, download it every day if that's what you want to do. And again, compare that data with some data sets that maybe you have on your side of the fence that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do. And this is the sort of data that you get back from the API. It's JSON structured. It has everything that you have available in that web interface. All of that same data, all of that underlying data that was behind those charts is available via the API. So another thing that we wanted to do when we were building this system was provide detailed data to contracted parties. So that is domain level data. So we have certain restrictions on how much we can share because some of our sources are commercial, and so we can't provide it all. But as much as possible, and where our licenses allow, we will share the domain level data with the contracted party who's responsible for it. So the registries get to see anything within their TLDs, and the registrars get to see anything that's within their portfolios. And they can't see anyone else. It's just their own data they can see. So Metrica is still evolving. We don't envisage it will ever actually be finished or completed. We'll always be getting feedback. We will always have new features we want to add, new research that we've conducted within our team that can push that functionality out via Metrica. And essentially, we're looking to have a continuous improvement cycle. So what today, if you look in 6-12 months' time, there will be new functionality, new features within Metrica. So at that point, I'm going to move on. I can take a few short questions if there are any, or I can take them at the end if people would prefer me move on.
I don't see any hands up or question in the chat, but I do have one for you, which is, do you use tools like focus groups to get feedback on Domain Metrica, like in terms of the features that you roll out over time?
So the way we've done it is we built first of all, we built what we wanted, what we felt we had a need for internally. And then we made that available to small pilot groups and got feedback and suggestions. This was before we made it available to the public. And then we made it available, first of all, to contracted parties so that they could see their data and give us feedback on that. And then we made it available to the general public. And now we're open to anyone to provide feedback. There's an email address in the FAQ if people have any suggestions or see any issues or bugs with the system. So feedback is invited. Focus groups were more like pilot phases, if that makes sense. So during the session at ICANN 83, we talked about another couple of research projects. So I'll just go over those briefly. The first was a bit of work that my colleague Sam Cheadle had done on batch registrations. So as a bit of background, we know that there are times when attackers want to conduct some large-scale campaign. So this could be phishing, sometimes it's spam, sometimes it's malware. And they know that domains are going to be used up during that campaign. At some point, they will work their way onto block lists and they'll become less useful over time. So then they'll have to switch to another domain and switch to another one and switch to another one. So a lot of these domains are created ahead of time. And we see these bulk or batch groups of registrations that are made together that look similar in some way, but they have some kind of detectable pattern because they're made together. They're made for a particular purpose. You can see sometimes that there are similarities in them. And so if you can detect those groups of domains early, maybe then when you see there's 10 domains in a group and one of them appears on a block list and then another one appears on a block list and then a third one appears, you can get ahead of the game if you like, and you can say 3 out of the 10 have appeared on this block list. There's a pretty good chance the other 7 will. So identifying these groups and looking at them and seeing how they behave can actually help defenders do their work once rather than 10 times. Because once you've made the determination on one, you can perhaps add that label to the others in that group of domains. So what Sam did was he looked at clustering or grouping recent registrations based on data that is publicly available. So not looking at things that only the registrar or the registry would have access to, but instead looking at the sponsoring registrar, looking at the name servers that the domains are sat on, and looking at the creation date. So are they created close in time to one another? Using those pieces of information, you can look at a set of registrations and you can say those domains are related. For some definition of related, we know that they're created but on the same registrar within 5 minutes of one another and they're using the same name servers. So in some ways they are related. And you can call that a batch of registrations. So then what Sam did was he looked at all of those batches and did that work of saying, okay, here's a batch of, let's say, 10 domains. How many of them appear on our block list? So how many have had reports of malicious behavior on them? And this is a plot of the data that he found by doing that. And each of the dots on this graph represents a single batch of domains. And then the color of the dot, sorry, the size of the dot is the number of domains within that batch. So the larger dots are, there's more domains in that batch. And then the color of the dot is looking at the proportion of those domains that have appeared within our reports of malicious behavior. And so you can see some interesting things from this plot. Firstly, some registrars have loads of batches, loads of their domains appear as part of a batch, but actually very few of them seem to have systemic abuse issues within those batches. So that you have some very large but completely blue dots. So lots of domains were created in a batch, but a very small number, maybe even none of them, have had reports of abuse. And then you see some registrars where actually most of the batches that we see on that registrar have a very high proportion of abusive domains within them. And then you see some registrars that have a mixture of behaviors. They have some batches where a lot of the domains are reported as abusive, but actually they have other batches where very few or none of those domains are reported as abusive. So what this says to us is that, yes, you see these batches of domains, but actually that doesn't equate to seeing batches of abusive domains. You also get batches of completely benign domains. Some statistics, I think I've covered most of that, what we say here. The numbers in the prevalent, so how many registrations were part of a batch and then how many were seen as having malicious reports. You can see the statistics there have changed. The statistics that were presented in the previous talk were for an early version of this work. And by filtering and doing more effective work on getting rid of false positives within that, or getting rid of batches where they're actually the association between those domains is not as close as we would like, that changes the statistics. So it's quite important, the work that we do, we're always refining the statistics, the methods, the algorithms that we use to try and get a picture that's closer to something that's the genuine truth. Okay. I've got time for a quick question on that. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to talk about a different project.
Okay. There is a question from Christabel, but I reckon it's a pretty broad one, so you can try your hand in answering it. She asks, what are the existing abuse mitigation mechanisms based on the various abuse classifications you explain? And at what point does law enforcement come in, perhaps?
That's a very interesting question. I can't answer it all briefly. The mechanisms available are dependent on what we see as the problem. If a domain has been maliciously registered, that it means it's created purely for the purposes of some kind of abusive content or abusive behavior, then the easiest option is to suspend that domain, to stop it resolving and to remove the harm that way. Some domains, however, they are not abusively registered, but they are compromised in some way. So maybe they have a content management system that has a flaw that allows a bad actor to introduce a phishing site under a legitimate domain. And in that instance, suspending the domain would actually be penalizing someone who's already a victim, right? The genuine registrant is already a victim. So there, the correct behavior would be to remove the harmful content. So if it's a particular URL under a legitimate domain, just remove that URL, don't suspend the whole domain because there's other legitimate content on it potentially. And in terms of law enforcement, sometimes they do get involved. Sometimes they take over the mitigation of the domain. It might mean a redirection into the law enforcement's infrastructure or some other mechanism that allows them to look at who's a victim of a particular crime. So can they do attribution? Can they see someone may have lost money and they can then get in contact with that person and hopefully find out where the victims are and make the reparations complete. Yeah, there's lots of different ways. I can't really go into them all, but hopefully that gives you a flavor of the sorts of things that happen to mitigate abuse.
Okay, I have a quick question. I saw one from Glenn, but I just wanted to ask if you were able to very briefly connect the dots between domain metrica, how the data is being used by registrars and even registries for that matter, to take action against what is possibly flagged as a malicious registration that's causing abuse.
Yeah. So the data we present in domain metrica, we clean it up as much as we can. But at the end of the day, we're repeating reports that have appeared on reputation block lists. Now, we can remove domains that don't resolve, for example, to clean up that data and remove some of the stuff that doesn't need to be seen by registries or registrars. But we know there will still be false positives in that data, and there will be a mixture of abusive registrations and compromised domains. So we present that data to contracted parties as is, for them to do with what they see fit. They may use it as part of an investigation. They may use it as part of a broader piece of work by their abuse team. But we never describe what we're providing as actionable, in that we don't expect them to just take those lists and suspend all of those domains that we tell them about. It's really just providing information that these are on a list. There's possibly good reasons they're on a list. They're possibly false positives, but we don't go into enough detail of that context for each one. Now, a lot of the work that we do, so the work I'm going to talk about next are the abuse uptime measurements and differentiating between abusive registrations and compromised domains. That's places where our research will become part of domain metrica and improve the amount of context that we can give to all of those reports. But at the end of the day, it's not actionable. It's stuff for informational purposes only, if that makes sense.
Okay, if I can just raise Glenn's question again, I'm not sure you're in a position to answer it, but you can try. In Canada, the new bill C8 called Critical Cyber Systems Protection Act is targeting the online fraud created by these sites, I guess. I am not sure how these sites will be held accountable.
I think if the word fraud is used as I understand it, that will have some overlap with phishing. So there will be some reports of that within our data, but fraud can be a lot more wide-ranging than the forms of abuse that we will list and look at. It can be very difficult to track down. You might have to look at financial transactions that happen after a site is used. We're not in a position to do a lot of that. It can be very in-depth investigations needing the credit card companies or financial institutions. But it sounds more like a law enforcement investigation than the sorts of things that we're looking at here.
I think it's certainly something that the law enforcement in Canada would have to get involved in. Okay, shall we move on then?
Okay. So one of the issues that we have with all the measurements that we've been making is that we're measuring the prevalence of abusive registrations or compromised domains. And so this really looks at the actions of the attacker, of the bad actors within this ecosystem. We want to also present metrics that show how the defenders are acting and what sort of actions taken actually decrease the opportunity for harm for any of these phishing, malware, command and control sites. So the idea is we measure how long the harmful content is available for. or the uptime of the abusive content is how we describe it. And so there's two ways that we've looked at doing this. One is active measurement. So we probe the sites looking for a response. Are they still serving the bad content? Are they still resolving? And then there's also passive measurement. So what have we seen that was just recorded that will give us a clue as to when the harmful content started? So can we look at things like passive DNS? So what DNS responses came back? When did things appear on block lists? And when did they appear or disappear from zone files? So when we use those methods, we see different ways, different average lengths of time, or different distributions in how long content is up for, depending on what content types we see. So here's a graph showing how quickly things are cleaned up, or how slowly things are cleaned up, based on what abuse type we're seeing. So you can see that things like botnet command and control tend to have a longer lifetime than, for example, phishing, potentially because phishing is just more visible. It's easier for an abuse team to diagnose because you can see the phishing page. So it's easier to justify taking it down. Whereas botnet command and control can be a more involved process, looking at malware samples and having them run in a sandbox, or actually decompiling them and seeing what they're using. So we can measure these uptimes, but one thing that we're trying to do, and it's an ongoing project, is getting those measurements as accurate as possible. Because if you get the more accurate your measurements of uptime, the more you can potentially show how certain policies or certain procedures are helping reduce those uptimes and have the harmful content available for less time. So this is an ongoing piece of research. We're hoping that the results of it will appear in Domain Metrica within about 6 months, maybe a bit more. Like I say, it's ongoing work. But it's also quite an important piece of work for showing the actions of the defenders rather than just measuring the actions of the bad guys. So that's something you'll see appearing in Metrica soon. So this is the project I spoke about at the beginning. It's called Infernal. It's ICANN funded rather than ICANN conducted. So we funded an external party to do this. It was a party called Core Labs, who work out of Grenoble University. There's a number of very academic papers and reports have come out of this work. A couple of links here. You can see there's a lot more detail in those reports than I can go into in a presentation, but I'll give an overview of what the project was and some of the findings from it. I just recommend, if you're interested, go to these more detailed reports and you'll get the more nuanced and correct picture from that. So the idea behind Infernal was to look at what factors during the process of registering a domain might drive a bad actor to use a particular combination of TLD and registrar over another. So what is it that makes certain TLD registrar combinations have a higher concentration of abuse? Or what is it that drives another combination of GTLD and registrar to have a lower concentration of abuse? And so lots of factors were looked at as part of this. And you can think of things like what's available during the registration process. So is there an API so I can write a script that creates my domains for me? what payment methods are accepted? So can I pay via cryptocurrency, for example, or do I have to write a check and put it in the post? How much does a domain cost in that space? What other services are provided as part of the registration process? And then other things which were referred to as proactive verification. So that's what checks are carried out during the registration process. So if I provide a telephone number or an email address, is that validated or at least looked to be syntactically correct? What restrictions are in place? So are there geographic restrictions? So I can only get a domain in this TLD if I'm resident in this particular country, or maybe it's tied to a particular professional qualification that you need to get a domain in a particular space. And then what reactive processes appear to be in place? So that's basically how quickly do reports of malicious domains get acted upon within that space. So all these factors were put into a statistical model, and it came up with a number of findings. So firstly, looking at, for example, looking at price, there was a positive correlation that a lower price tends to lead to an increase in the amount of abusive content within that space. But actually, that correlation is weaker than the correlation to discount within that space. Also, acceptance of cryptocurrency seems to have a positive correlation to abuse. So accepting cryptocurrency tends to lead then to an increase in abuse. And one thing that's gained a lot of publicity, if you like, from this report is the link between that availability of automating domain creation and an increase in the amount of abuse seen. There's also correlation between providing those services, so free hosting, free DNS provision, that just simplifies the process of turning your domain registration into something that's actually active and usable. And then, of course, some of the more restrictive policies, they have a negative effect on abuse. So restricting registration or valid of registrant details seem to reduce the amount of abuse in that space. Interestingly, looking at the reactive measures, so having shorter uptime of abusive content has negligible, so it's very close to zero correlation to the amount of abuse seen. But what's important to note with all of these figures is that a lot of those factors will also be preferable to legitimate registrations as well. So the availability of cryptocurrency as a payment method, for example, will be attractive to lots of people who do not have malicious intent with their domain. So any changes that are made to limit abusive concentrations will also affect legitimate parties at the same time. And none of these things are happening in isolation. So the model looks at them and tries to isolate them, but all of these things are happening at the same time. All of these factors are varying at the same time. Yeah, so lots of disclaimers about the interpretation of this data. And like I say, if you're interested in this and you want the more detailed discussion on it, there's a couple of references earlier in this presentation, or you can go to the SSR webpage and you can see a lot more detail and get longer presentations that give a better, more in-depth discussion on all of these things. But that is my final slide. So I will ask if there are any questions. There's an email address there where you can contact the team So if you have any questions that occur to you after this presentation, or if we run out of time, feel free to get in touch and we can provide links or answers to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Yes, excellent. Thanks, Sean. There are 2 questions in chat. First one from Christabel. Is your team looking into other abuse trends that are not time-based, such as when you explain batch registrations?
Yes. So one of the presentations that we'll give at ICANN 85 is the evolution of that batch registration work. So more about that piece around associated domains. We'll have a lot more time to look at the detail and the latest iterations, the evolution of that work. So if you're interested in that in particular, catch that session either live or in the recordings, I would suggest.
Okay, I'm going to carry on. Ask Maciek's question. Do you see your data being used for machine learning-based mitigation solutions? Do you work with those organizations actively to make sure your data is optimized for that use?
So the data we provide is the data that we're allowed to within our license conditions. And we impose no restrictions on the usage of that then. So most of it, if we're talking about stuff that you would want to do machine learning on, would be the raw data, where we're only providing it to the contracted parties responsible for the domains in question. So I don't think that would provide a very good training set. I think if you wanted data as a training set, you would go back to the source in order to see the whole picture. So rather than the partial picture that we're providing, but we don't put any constraints, expectations, restrictions on the data we provide. It's completely open for people to do with what they see fit. It just may not be the right data for that purpose.
Okay, I just want to conclude by thanking Sean. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's safe to say that most people did enjoy it and were very engaged in listening to what you have to share. And we look forward to having you and Sam in Mumbai to carry on this very interesting topic.
Look forward to it.